Picture a vast, shimmering tapestry of gold and spice, stretching across deserts and mountains, connecting empires from Rome to China. This is the Silk Road, as we've been taught, a celebrated highway of culture and commerce, where silk, ideas, and treasures flowed freely between civilizations. But beneath this glittering surface lies a shadowed path, one stained with blood, betrayal, and secrets swallowed by time. For every merchant's tale of adventure, there's an untold story of violence. For every exchange of goods, there was a hidden cost paid in human suffering. This isn't just the Silk Road of history books, it's the real, unfiltered network where ambition collided with brutality, and where the price of progress was often measured in lives. Think of the caravans winding through the Taklamakan Desert, their camels laden with luxuries. We imagine the romance of distant lands, the thrill of discovery. But what about the slaves forced to carry those goods under the scorching sun? The bandits who ambushed travelers, leaving their bones to bleach in the sand. The cities that flourished one day and vanished the next, swallowed by conquest or plague. The Silk Road wasn't just a route. It was a stage for some of history's darkest dramas, where greed and power played out in ways you've never heard. That's what we're uncovering today, 30 dark truths buried beneath the legend. From the epidemic that ravaged continents to the ruthless warlords who turned trade into terror, these are the stories history glossed over. This journey won't be easy, but it will change how you see the Silk Road forever. So settle in, we're peeling back the layers of myth to reveal the raw, unvarnished reality of the world's most infamous trade network. The truth is waiting, and it's darker than you ever imagined. The name Silk Road conjures images of delicate fabrics winding their way from China to the Mediterranean, but this legendary network dealt in far more than luxury textiles. Silk may have been the glittering symbol, but the real trade was brutal, chaotic, and steeped in exploitation. Slaves shuffled in chains alongside spice caravans. Opium and hallucinogens passed hands in shadowed market stalls. Blades forged in Damascus and armor from Samarkand armed empires and the warlords who preyed on them. Take the slave markets of Samarkand, where captured men, women, and children were sold like livestock to the highest bidder. Byzantine chronicles tell of entire villages emptied by raiders. Their people marched hundreds of miles to be traded for silver or horses. And it wasn't just the weak who suffered. Even princes and scholars could end up in bondage if their caravan was ambushed. The Silk Road didn't just move goods, it trafficked human lives on an industrial scale. Then there were the drugs. Opium from Afghanistan numbed the pain of laborers and warriors alike, while hashish from the mountains of Persia flowed into wealthy circles. These weren't just indulgences, they were tools of control. Rulers taxed addiction, and merchants grew rich off desperation. Even the famed Marco Polo recorded chests of medicinal powders exchanged for gold, a euphemism for substances that fueled dependency across continents. But perhaps most chilling was the arms trade. The same routes that carried porcelain and jade also supplied the Mongol hordes with siege weapons, the Byzantines with Greek fire recipes, and assassins with their daggers. Every breakthrough in metallurgy or chemistry became a commodity, often turning tranquil cities into battlegrounds. When Baghdad fell to the Mongols in 1258, it wasn't just an army at the gates. It was Silk Road technology, catapults, gunpowder, tactics, bought, borrowed, or stolen along the way. This wasn't some noble exchange of cultures. It was a sprawling black market where everything had a price, and morality crumbled like sand beneath camel hooves. The real Silk Road didn't just connect civilizations, it armed them, addicted them, and enslaved them. And that's just the first dark truth. Beneath the silk and spice, the true backbone of this trade network wasn't luxury, it was human flesh. Slavery wasn't just a side business on the Silk Road. It was the engine that kept the caravans moving. From the frozen steppes of Central Asia to the bustling ports of the Mediterranean, captive men, women, and children were bartered as ruthlessly as bolts of fabric or sacks of grain. The sheer scale would stagger modern imaginations. Take the sprawling markets of Bukhara, where Slavic captives from the north rubbed shoulders with Ethiopian prisoners from the south, all branded and priced by the strength of their backs or the fairness of their skin. The Abbasid Caliphate's elite filled their palaces with Turkish slave soldiers known as Mamluks, while Tang dynasty officials stocked their estates with Persian musicians and Sogdian dancers. These weren't isolated cases. Entire economies depended on human cargo. The Sogdian traders, famed as the middlemen of the Silk Road, moved slaves as efficiently as they did jewels, with trade routes stretching from Constantinople to Chang'an. But the darkest auctions happened in Khazar territory, where Viking slavers from the north met Muslim merchants from the south. Here, young Scandinavian captives could end up as bodyguards in Baghdad, while Circassian girls were shipped to pleasure houses in Damascus. Even scholars weren't spared. The brilliant Persian astronomer Al-Khwarizmi recorded how educated slaves fetched premium prices in Samarkand's markets, their knowledge making them valuable commodities. The Mongols took this horror to industrial levels. After sacking a city, they'd sought survivors like livestock artisans were sent to Karakoram, warriors were pressed into service, and the rest were marched to distant markets. When Genghis Khan's forces crushed the Khwarazmian Empire, historians wrote of caravans so long they darkened the horizon, tens of thousands chained together under the whip. This wasn't ancient history's shadow, it was daylight reality. The Silk Road's glittering legacy was built on the backs of people who never saw a coin of its profits, only the shackles of its trade. If you think highway robbery is a modern problem, the Silk Road would shatter that illusion. This wasn't just a trade route, it was a gauntlet where merchants gambled their lives with every mile. Bandits didn't lurk in the shadows here. They ruled entire stretches of the road, turning mountain passes and desert oases into their private hunting grounds. The further you traveled from imperial patrols, the more your caravan became prey. Take the infamous Lop Nor region, a wasteland where the bones of failed expeditions marked the trail like grim signposts. Chinese chronicles tell of a merchant party ambushed near Dunhuang, 60 men slaughtered in minutes, their silk and silver vanishing into the dunes, the survivors. Those left handless or footless as a warning to others. Even the famed monk Xuanzang, who made the journey to India, wrote of hiding among corpses to escape raiders, holding his breath as thieves rifled through the dead. But the true masters of terror were the Kara Kittens, nomadic warlords who turned banditry into an empire. They didn't just steal goods, they sold protection to caravans. Pay or perish. One particularly brutal tactic involved nailing merchants' feet to wooden planks unless they revealed where their wealth was hidden. The Venetian trader Pegalotti advised travelers to budget twice the cost of goods just for bribes and ransom, calling it the price of air between cities. Then there were the oasis towns, which often played both sides. Places like Turfan appeared as safe havens but sometimes doubled as traps. Innkeepers might drug a merchant's tea, then sell the unconscious victim to slavers by morning. The Buddhist pilgrim Faxian recounted waking in chains after trusting a kindly local guide. His manuscripts burned, his companions gone. Violence wasn't an exception, it was baked into the economics. Insurance didn't exist, guards could be bought off, and for every legendary merchant who retired rich, a dozen more vanished without a trace. The Silk Road didn't just carry goods, it fed on the desperate and the doomed, leaving their stories buried under centuries of sand and silence. The Silk Road didn't just transport silks and spices, it delivered death on an apocalyptic scale. While merchants celebrated the exchange of goods, invisible killers hitched rides in wool, grain, and even the breath of travelers. This network didn't just connect empires, it became the perfect breeding ground for pandemics that would reshape civilizations. The most infamous, the Black Death, which didn't just travel the Silk Road, it used it like a firestorm consuming dry timber. Imagine a flea clinging to a rat in a caravan's grain sack, hopping from host to host as carts rolled from Kashgar to Crimea. By the time merchants noticed the first feverish symptoms, the plague had already leapfrogged 3 cities ahead. The Mongols inadvertently turned their trade routes into a microbiological highway. When they catapulted plague-ridden corpses over the walls of Kaffa in 1346, they weren't just waging war, they were unleashing a biological weapon that would kill millions. Within 2 years, the Black Death reached Europe, wiping out half the continent's population. But this wasn't an isolated tragedy. The Antonine Plague, thought to be smallpox, raced down Roman roads from Silk Road ports, killing Emperor Marcus Aurelius and 5 million others. The Justinian Plague of 541 followed the same paths, with Constantinople losing 10,000 people a day at its peak. These weren't random outbreaks, they were predictable disasters. Every oasis town, every crowded caravanserai was a petri dish where unfamiliar germs met defenseless populations. Even more chilling, some cities became silent graves almost overnight. Take the Lulan Kingdom, a thriving Silk Road hub near the Tarim Basin. Archaeologists found its streets littered with skeletal remains mid-meal, as if a shadow passed over and extinguished every life at once. No war, no famine, just a disease so swift it left no time for burials. The Silk Road's greatest legacy wasn't cultural exchange. It was a brutal lesson in globalization's dark side. When roads open, pestilence walks through first. The riches of the Silk Road didn't just build cities, they burned them. For every fortune made in trade, there was a warlord sharpening his sword, eyeing the caravans like blood in the water. This wasn't just commerce, it was a catalyst for conquest. The same gold that lined merchant pockets funded armies, bought alliances, and turned peaceful frontiers into battlefields. And nowhere was this deadlier than in the centuries-long tug of war between the steppe nomads and the settled empires. Take the Mongol juggernaut. Before Genghis Khan united the tribes, the Silk Road was a patchwork of petty kingdoms and rival clans, each taxing caravans until merchants bled dry. But the Mongols saw something deeper. Control the trade routes and you control the world. Their conquests weren't just about land, they were about monopolizing the flow of silk, silver, and steel. When the Khwarezmian Empire made the fatal mistake of executing Mongol envoys in 1218, it wasn't just revenge that drove Genghis Khan's hordes. It was the lure of Samarkand's treasury, the chokehold on Transoxiana's trade nodes, and the chance to reroute every ounce of wealth straight into Mongol coffers. The Tang dynasty learned this lesson the hard way. Their glittering capital, Chang'an, was the eastern anchor of the Silk Road, but its wealth made it a target. In 755, the rebel general Anlushan, a Sogdian Turkic mercenary who'd grown fat on border trade profits, turned his army against the emperor. What followed was 8 years of carnage, millions dead, and a dynasty crippled by the very commerce that had built it. The Tang never fully recovered, proving a bitter truth: the road that brought riches could also bring ruin. Even the Romans weren't immune. Their insatiable demand for Chinese silk drained imperial treasuries, sparking currency crises and desperate campaigns to secure eastern trade routes. Emperor Heraclius practically bankrupted Byzantium, fighting the Sassanids over control of Syrian silk markets, a war so costly it left both empires gasping when the Arab armies swept in. But perhaps the most twisted irony, the Pax Mongolica, that fabled peace under Mongol rule, was built on rivers of blood. Yes, caravans moved safely from Budapest to Beijing, but only because anyone who challenged Mongol taxes was flayed alive as a warning. The Silk Road didn't end wars, it just made them more profitable. And in that brutal calculus, every bale of silk came with a hidden price: the swords it sharpened, the armies it fed, and the kingdoms it doomed. They called it cultural exchange, the glorious meeting of East and West, where music, art, and ideas flowed as freely as silk, but history loves to romanticize. For every Buddhist statue carried to Persia or Roman glass traded in Chang'an, there were entire cultures ground underfoot, their languages silenced, their gods toppled, their stories rewritten by conquerors' hands. The Silk Road didn't just connect civilizations, it became a weapon of cultural erasure where the weak were forced to kneel before the strong. Take the Kingdom of Cotton, a thriving oasis of Buddhism along the Tarim Basin. Its vibrant traditions, sand-swept monasteries, ancient Sanskrit manuscripts, lotus motifs carved into temple walls, vanished almost overnight when the Kara-Khanid Turks stormed in during the 10th century. Chronicles describe libraries set ablaze, monks slaughtered mid-prayer, and the surviving artists forced to chisel Islamic calligraphy over their own sacred art. This wasn't coexistence, it was cultural genocide repeated across the Silk Road wherever empires clashed. The Mongols perfected this brutality. When they conquered Persia, they didn't just loot, they reshaped identities. Persian bureaucrats were ordered to abandon their script for Mongolian. Poets were forced to compose odes to Genghis Khan in his own tongue, and entire legal systems were overwritten with the Decode. Resistance meant annihilation. In one grotesque twist, survivors in Bukhara were compelled to wear their traditional robes inside out as a public humiliation, a visible symbol of their erased heritage. Even the Tang dynasty, often celebrated for cosmopolitan tolerance, practiced ruthless cynicization. Her musicians brought to Chang'an weren't just entertainers. They were hostages. Their songs were written with Tang lyrics praising imperial glory. Sogdian merchants, once the backbone of Transoxiana's economy, found their Zoroastrian temples demolished unless they adopted Mandarin surnames and Confucian rites. Assimilation wasn't a choice, it was the price of survival. Perhaps most haunting were the lost languages, the Tucherian tongue of the Tarim Basin, the Sokha dialects of the Pamirs, even the Greek lingering in Bactria from Alexander's day. All were suffocated under the weight of Arabic, Persian, and Chinese. A 9th century monk's diary found near Dunhuang laments teaching his students Sanskrit in secret, knowing his people's speech was becoming just whispers in the wind. This was the dark undercurrent of the Silk Road's so-called Golden Age. Every tapestry woven with foreign threads meant another tradition unraveled. Every shared idea carried the fingerprints of coercion. The road didn't just transport culture, it flattened it, leaving behind a monochrome legacy where only the conqueror's voices echo. The Silk Road's legacy isn't just written in ruins and artifacts, it's etched into the very land it crossed. For centuries, historians marveled at the road's ability to connect civilizations, but few noticed the scars it left on the earth itself. The price of progress wasn't just paid in blood and gold, it was exacted from forests, rivers, and grasslands that never recovered. This wasn't just a trade route, it was an ecological bulldozer, reshaping landscapes with a ruthlessness that still echoes today. Take the once lush foothills of the Tine Shan Mountains, where towering stands of walnut and mulberry trees vanished under the axes of caravan builders. Every mile of road required thousands of wooden carts, and every cart meant another tree felled. By the Tang dynasty's peak, entire slopes stood barren, their soil washing away in rains that now flooded valleys instead of nourishing them. The Sogdians, master traders of Central Asia, didn't just sell goods, they stripped entire forests for firewood to melt metals and bake ceramics, leaving behind a wasteland where only the stumps of ancient oaks remained. Then there was the water. Oases that had sustained travelers for millennia began to vanish under the relentless demand of caravanserais, those roadside inns that dotted the route. A single stop might host hundreds of camels, each drinking over 20 gallons a day. The ancient city of Merv, once called the Queen of the World for its lush gardens, saw its aquifers drained dry by the 12th century. Wells that had bubbled for generations turned to dust, forcing merchants to dig deeper, only to collapse the fragile water tables beneath. What the Mongols didn't destroy with siege engines, the Silk Road choked with thirst. But the most irreversible damage came from the animals themselves. The endless streams of horses, yaks, and Bactrian camels didn't just carry goods, they devoured grasslands down to the roots. In the Pamir Mountains, overgrazing turned emerald valleys into dust bowls, forcing nomadic tribes into violent clashes over shrinking pastures. The same camels that carried silk from China also carried the seeds of their own destruction, their hooves compacting the soil until nothing could grow. Scientists studying lakebed sediments in Kazakhstan found layers of dust dating precisely to the Silk Road's zenith, a silent record of ecological collapse written in mud and pollen. Even the deserts expanded in the road's wake. The Taklamakan, already one of Earth's most unforgiving wastelands, swallowed cities like Lulan and Nia as overuse of fragile river systems disrupted ancient hydrology. Sand dunes crept over abandoned caravanserais, burying not just buildings but the very evidence of what had been lost. Today, satellite images reveal ghostly outlines of settlements miles from modern water sources, testaments to how trade routes redirected nature itself. The cruelest irony, many of these ecological time bombs detonated long after the Silk Road faded. The Aral Sea, once a thriving fishery fed by glaciers nurtured in untouched mountains, began its death spiral when medieval irrigation canals diverted rivers to grow cotton for export. By the time Russian explorers mapped the region in the 19th century, they found dust storms where fishing boats once sailed, a delayed disaster set in motion centuries earlier by the road's insatiable demands. This wasn't just collateral damage, it was a warning written in the land itself. The Silk Road didn't just move goods, it moved entire ecosystems toward ruin, proving that even the greatest human networks are bound by the limits of the natural world. And those limits, once crossed, never forgive. The road's greatest predators didn't lurk in mountain passes or desert wastes, they sat behind desks in silk robes, their ink-stained fingers picking caravans cleaner than any bandit's blade. For every merchant braving the wilderness, there was a far deadlier threat waiting at city gates, the officials and tax collectors who turned bureaucracy into a weapon. This wasn't just administration, it was systemic extortion, where the law itself became a tool for theft. Take the Tang dynasty's border checkpoints, where inspectors wielded rulers like swords. A single bolt of silk might be measured 3 times, each reading intentionally skewed to declare it underweight and subject to confiscation. Persian traders wrote of bribing clerks just to use honest scales, while Byzantine envoys complained of being charged breathing taxes for the time their camels spent resting in imperial territory. The deeper you traveled into China, the more creative the schemes became. Merchants in Chang'an recounted being taxed for the dust on their wagons, calculated by sweeping it into official jars and weighing it as imported soil. But the Silk Road's true masters of graft were the Sogdians, whose trading prowess masked a web of corruption. Their caravanserais doubled as blackmail hubs, where guards would discover contraband in merchants' bags unless a fee made it vanish. A 9th century contract found near Turfan spells it out plainly. 10 silver coins to the inspector, 5 to the scribe, or the pepper becomes smuggled by morning. Even death wasn't an escape. Wills were routinely lost unless families paid notaries half the inheritance. The Mongols institutionalized this rapacity. Their Yam postal system, hailed for speed, became a nightmare for traders. Station masters demanded gifts to forward goods, with delays increasing until the bribes grew lavish enough. A merchant's diary from Karakoram describes being stranded for months until he surrendered a prized jade carving only to watch the station master toss it to his children as a toy. Perhaps most insidious were the religious exemptions. Buddhist monasteries along the route often held tax-free status until abbots realized they could charge merchants donations to store goods in sanctuary warehouses. A scandal erupted in cotton when monks were caught swapping high-quality silk for cheap replicas while safeguarding shipments, their prayer halls stacked with stolen luxuries. This wasn't just petty theft, it reshaped entire economies. Silk prices in Europe skyrocketed not from scarcity, but because every official along 12,000 miles demanded their cut. A single bolt leaving Xi'an could be inspected, stamped, and adjusted over 30 times before reaching Antioch, each hand dipping into the pouch, the real dark truth. The Silk Road didn't just enrich empires, it built fortunes for the men who made trade a living hell. For every merchant hauling silks or spices along the Silk Road, there was another traveler with far deadlier cargo secrets. The same caravans that carried luxuries also smuggled stolen maps, coded messages, and whispered intelligence that toppled kingdoms. This wasn't just a trade network, it was history's most expansive spy corridor, where diplomats doubled as saboteurs and even monks carried more than prayers in their scrolls. The road's chaos, its mix of languages, its constant flow of strangers, made it the perfect cover for espionage on an unimaginable scale. The Tang dynasty's collapse offers a chilling case study. In the 8th century, their western frontier boiled with tension as the Tibetans and Arabs vied for control of trade routes. Enter An Lushan, the half-Sogdian, half-Turkic general who rose to prominence by cultivating informants among Silk Road merchants. These weren't just casual observers, they were trained agents posing as rug sellers or tea traders, documenting troop movements and fort weaknesses. When An launched his rebellion in 755, his spies had already bribed Tang border guards to stand down, while others spread disinformation that paralyzed imperial responses. By the time the emperor realized the threat, An's forces were burning the outskirts of Chang'an itself, but the Mongols turned espionage into an art form. Their scouts didn't just ride ahead of armies, they infiltrated cities years in advance. A Persian chronicler describes how Genghis Khan's agents posed as leatherworkers in Bukhara, mapping sewer systems later used by sappers to collapse walls. Others spread rumors to fracture alliances, like the false letters leaked to turn the Khwarezmian Shah against his own generals, the most brazen operatives. The orphaned children of conquered cities, raised as Mongols and sent back to their homelands as sleeper agents. Even religion became a weapon of subterfuge. Nestorian Christian missionaries, welcomed for their healing skills, were often caught sketching fortress layouts in their Bibles. Buddhist pilgrims like Xuanzang carried imperial intelligence coded into sutra translations, a trick the Chinese repeated centuries later with Jesuit missionaries. The Vatican's archives still hold letters from Silk Road bishops warning of shepherds who count sheep not for God but for kings, the ultimate irony. Some of history's most celebrated travelers were likely spies. Marco Polo's detailed descriptions of Yuan dynasty military logistics, down to the exact number of horses at way stations, aligned suspiciously with Venetian naval interests. The Arab geographer Ibn Battuta's sudden detours into Indian fortresses coincide with periods of intense Muslim-Hindu conflict. Whether they knew it or not, their accounts became intelligence goldmines. This shadow war had permanent consequences. When the Mongols sacked Baghdad in 1258, it wasn't just brute force that doomed the city. It was years of spies reporting which gates were rotten, which officials could be bribed, and which water channels to poison first. The Silk Road didn't just connect east and west, it taught empires how to destroy each other from within, one whispered secret at a time. Beneath the Silk Road's romantic veneer lies a grim accounting the ledgers of merchants who never reached their destinations. These weren't just isolated tragedies, vanishing was an occupational hazard. Caravan rosters from Dunhuang reveal 1 in 5 traders marked lost between stops, their fates reduced to a bureaucratic footnote. Some disappearances became legends, like the ill-fated Persian silk convoy of 986 that entered the Taklamakan with 300 camels and emerged with only 17. the rest swallowed by a sandstorm so vast, later travelers reported finding bleached bones still lashed together with rotting rope. The Gobi Desert held particular terrors. Chinese chronicles described the singing sands, dunes that emitted eerie hums before collapsing onto entire caravans. In 2014, archaeologists unearthed a merchant party near Turfan, their bodies preserved in dry air, fingers still clutching silk bundles. Scorch marks on their robes and melted silver in their pouches suggested their end came not from thirst, but from a freak lightning storm igniting the highly flammable silk they carried. Nature wasn't the only killer. The Lop Nor region became known as the land where shadows eat men, after a Sogdian trading family vanished in 1112, only for their mummified remains to surface centuries later, the father's skull split by an axe still wedged in bone. Bandits perfected the art of making victims disappear. The Kara kittens would ambush caravans at dusk, slaughtering every witness, then reroute the surviving pack animals to fake destinations. A Byzantine diplomat's journal tells of finding a ghost caravan near Samarkand, 12 fully laden camels wandering without riders, their cargo intact but their owner's ledger ending mid-sentence. The most chilling finds were the silent caravans, groups discovered camped around cold fire pits, their members dead without wounds or signs of struggle. Modern toxicologists suspect they were poisoned by contaminated well water, their last moments spent unknowingly drinking death. Even seasoned explorers fell prey to the road's illusions. The Buddhist pilgrim Faxian wrote of seeing phantom caravanserais in the Taklamakan, elaborate rest stops that vanished upon approach, likely mirages that lured desperate travelers off marked paths. In 2008, satellite imaging revealed the ruins of a Tang Dynasty merchant outpost buried under 60 feet of sand, its storerooms still stacked with untouched bolts of silk. The absence of bodies suggests its occupants walked into the dunes searching for help that never came, their footprints erased by the wind within hours. The cruelest fate belonged to those who vanished by choice. Tax records from Cotton mention merchants who staged their own deaths, burning portions of their goods to fake bandit attacks before fleeing with the remainder. But the Silk Road had its own justice. Cracked skulls found in remote passes sometimes cradled forged travel permits, their owners discovered by the very authorities they'd hoped to evade. These weren't just missing persons cases, they were cautionary tales whispered in caravanserais, reminding every trader that the road gave riches but never guaranteed safe passage home. The glittering fortunes of Silk Road merchants weren't spun from silk alone, they were woven on the broken backs of nameless thousands. While kings and khans toasted their wealth in marble palaces, the real work fell to those who could least afford it. Peasants forced to abandon their fields for caravan labor, children drafted to clean camel pens, and entire villages conscripted to maintain roads that would never bring them profit. This wasn't just inequality, it was an economic machine built to grind the poor into dust. Consider the silk producers of Henan province, where families were ordered to dedicate every waking hour to mulberry groves and silkworm trays. Tang Dynasty tax records show some households surrendering 90% of their annual silk output, leaving barely enough fabric to clothe their own shivering children. Those who fell behind faced brutal punishments. A 7th century edict prescribed flogging for farmers delivering inferior silk, while rebels had their hands nailed to the looms they'd operated. The very fabric that draped Roman emperors often came from homes where hunger was a constant loom shuttle, weaving despair into every thread. Road maintenance became another form of institutionalized cruelty. Along the Hexi corridor, farmers were yanked from planting season to break stones under the whip of Mongol overseers. A Dunhuang scroll lists 43 workers who died in a single summer repairing mountain passes, their families then charged for the lost labor through increased grain taxes. Even the celebrated caravanserais hid horror. Excavation of a ruined rest stop near Merv revealed cramped underground cells where indentured servants slept chained to mortar bowls, their bones showing the telltale deformities of lifelong crushing and grinding. The most vulnerable were the road children, orphans pressed into service as camel tenders and firewood gatherers. Persian chronicler Rashid al-Din describes boys no older than 8 forced to walk ahead of caravans through snowstorms, testing ice thickness with their light frames. Those who fell through were simply replaced. Girls fared worse. Merchant ledgers from Samarkand list them as assets alongside pack animals, valued for their ability to mend torn fabrics or entertain wealthy travelers. Some contracts included clauses transferring ownership of these children as collateral for bad debts. Elites justified this exploitation through perverse economics. A Yuan dynasty minister famously argued that peasant suffering was necessary because silk must flow like water, even if blood must flow first. The road's success depended on keeping base laborers desperate enough to accept starvation wages, a truth laid bare in 14th century Kashgar, where weavers' revolts were put down by flooding their quarters with cheap Turkestani slaves. The system didn't just take advantage of poverty, it actively engineered it, ensuring a permanent underclass with no escape. Perhaps the ultimate indignity was how thoroughly these lives were erased. Of the thousands of laborer graves excavated along the Tarim Basin, less than 1% contained personal effects, just nameless skeletons with spines curved from decades of heavy loads. Their anonymous suffering funded empires they'd never see, for luxuries they'd never touch, on a road that would never carry them home. The Silk Road preached tolerance in one breath and crushed it with the next. While history remembers this network as a crossroads of faith, where Buddhist statues, Christian crosses, and Zoroastrian fire altars stood side by side, the reality was far darker. For every caravan that carried sacred texts, there were mobs waiting to burn them. For every wandering monk sharing wisdom, there were rulers ready to silence him. Religious minorities didn't just travel the Silk Road, they survived it by hiding their prayers in cellars and their gods in plain sight. Take the fate of the Nestorian Christians, whose churches once dotted the route from Persia to China. These early missionaries recorded converting Turkic tribes in the 7th century, only to be betrayed when Muslim conquerors rose to power. In Merv, a thriving Nestorian community was given a brutal choice: convert to Islam or pay the jizya tax, a fee so crushing it forced most into destitution. Those who resisted faced the sword. A 9th century manuscript found in Dunhuang describes monks fleeing with scraps of the Bible sewn into their robes, while their monastery's library went up in flames behind them. Buddhists fared no better under expanding Islamic rule. The Karakhanid Turks, eager to prove their devotion, turned the oasis town of Kashgar into a slaughterhouse. Temples were razed, their gold-leafed Buddha statues melted down for coinage. A surviving fragment from a monk's diary recounts soldiers using sacred scrolls to light cooking fires, laughing as they tossed millennia of philosophy into the flames. The few monks who escaped retreated into caves like those at Mogao, where they sealed away their greatest treasures rather than let them be defiled. But perhaps the most tragic victims were the Zoroastrians, Persia's ancient fire worshippers. Arab invaders systematically dismantled their temples, branding the sacred flame as idolatry. In Bukhara, converts were forced to urinate on fire altars to demonstrate their rejection of the old ways. Those who clung to their faith became pariahs. A 10th century geographer wrote of Zoroastrian villages where children were snatched and raised as Muslims, while elders starved in mountain hideouts. Even the Mongols, famed for their religious tolerance, used faith as a political tool. While Genghis Khan's empire allowed multiple religions, his successors played them against each other. In Tabriz, Buddhist monks were given tax exemptions to provoke Muslim resentment, while Christian envoys received prime trading rights to weaken Persian power. It wasn't coexistence, it was a calculated strategy of divide and conquer, where every prayer became a potential weapon. The road's greatest irony, some of its holiest sites doubled as execution grounds. The bustling market of Samarkand saw Jews forced to wear identifying yellow badges, while Hindu traders from India were mocked for bathing in the Zarafshan River, until local warlords declared the practice polluting and banned it entirely. In Chang'an, Sogdian merchants practicing Zoroastrian sky burials were accused of dark magic when vultures picked clean their exposed dead. Fear turned neighbor against neighbor. A single rumor of blasphemy could empty a caravanserai by dawn, leaving its owner ruined. This wasn't just persecution, it was erasure. Languages of worship vanished as scriptures burned. Holy days were struck from calendars. Generations grew up knowing their ancestors' gods only as whispered stories. The Silk Road didn't just transport religions, it filtered them through fire and steel, leaving behind only the faith strong enough to bend without breaking. And in that merciless winnowing, entire spiritual worlds turned to ash. The shimmering jewels and fragrant spices that filled Silk Road markets didn't just symbolize wealth, they carried the weight of suffering etched into every gemstone and peppercorn. Behind every ounce of luxury was a chain of exploitation stretching from mines to plantations, where forced laborers toiled under conditions so brutal, even the era's most hardened merchants averted their eyes. The road's glittering facade was built on the backs of those who never tasted the comforts their work created. Take the emerald mines of Badakhshan, where prisoners and debtors were lowered into narrow shafts on ropes that doubled as nooses. A single misstep could send a man plummeting hundreds of feet, his body left where it fell to avoid unlucky disruptions to production. Persian geographers wrote of miners emerging blind after years in tortuous tunnels, their hands permanently curled into claws from chiseling stones in freezing darkness. And for what? A single emerald might buy a prince's ransom in Constantinople, but the men who dug it earned barely enough gruel to survive the next season. Spice plantations hid even darker secrets. In the Malabar coast, where black pepper grew like gold, entire villages were enslaved to harvest the prickly vines. Workers developed permanent lung scars from inhaling pepper dust, while overseers whipped those who slowed under the equatorial sun. Arab trader logs candidly note how monsoon season harvests yielded the highest mortality rates. Drowned bodies were simply tallied as spoiled goods in ledgers. Even more horrifying were the cinnamon forests of Sri Lanka, where legends of guardian snakes were encouraged to keep laborers from stealing. In reality, those who fled were hunted with trained dogs and returned to face amputations, a standard punishment recorded in Chola dynasty edicts. The silk industry's cruelty was equally systematic. Mulberry groves in Shandong became death traps for child laborers, their small fingers prized for untangling delicate silkworm threads. Imperial inspectors noted children as young as 6 working 16-hour shifts, their eyesight ruined by meticulous work in dim light. Those who damaged cocoons faced beatings or confinement in repentance boxes, wooden crates where they crouched for days without food. The very fabric that clothed emperors was spun from the broken health of generations. Perhaps most sinister was the manipulation of entire economies. In cotton, jade prospectors were lured into debt slavery through advance payments for hypothetical fines. Once trapped, they mined riverbeds until their bones ached, while middlemen resold their discoveries for hundredfold profits. A 9th-century contract discovered near Hotten spells out the terms. The worker owes his life to the stone until the debt is cleared. Many died trying, their corpses buried in unmarked gravel pits later excavated by new desperate hands. This wasn't just hard labor, it was a calculated system of dehumanization. Goldsmiths in Samarkand had their tongues split to prevent them swallowing gold flakes. Pearl divers in the Persian Gulf were weighted with stones and denied surfacing until their baskets overflowed. The road's famous luxuries didn't just have price tags, they had body counts written in the unmarked graves stretching from mines to markets. And those who wore the jewels or sprinkled the spices rarely paused to consider whose blood seasoned their wealth. The Silk Road didn't just traffic silks and spices, It became the ancient world's most efficient drug pipeline, funneling addiction across continents long before the word narcotic existed. Opium, hashish, and hallucinogens flowed as freely as gold, ensnaring emperors and peasants alike in a web of dependency that empires learned to harness as a tool of control. This wasn't casual indulgence, it was organized exploitation, where merchants and rulers conspired to turn human weakness into profit. Afghanistan's opium fields fed the deadliest trade. By the 9th century, Arab physicians noted how the region's tears of the poppy traveled east to China and west to Persia, disguised as medicine. But the line between remedy and vice blurred quickly. Tang Dynasty records describe officials consuming opium-laced black soup to dull the pains of office, only to find themselves hollow-eyed addicts trading state secrets for their next dose. In Samarkand, entire market stalls specialized in dream powders, where merchants hawked opium pellets alongside saffron, their customers swaying between ecstasy and ruin. The Mongols weaponized this trade. When Genghis Khan's armies conquered Khwarezm, they spared opium growers, conscripting them to supply troops with strength elixirs. Soldiers marched farther, fought longer, and feared less until withdrawal turned them into shuddering wrecks. By Kublai Khan's reign, opium taxes funded entire campaigns, while addicted enemies became pliant puppets. A Persian chronicle describes one besieged city whose defenders surrendered not to swords, but to baskets of opium-dipped fruit lowered over their walls. But the most insidious dealers wore robes, not armor. Buddhist monasteries in Gandhara cultivated vast poppy fields, selling compassionate relief to pilgrims while stockpiling silver. In Cairo, Sufi mystics distributed hashish sweets to initiate spiritual journeys, then charged disciples for ever stronger doses. Even Marco Polo documented Venetian merchants trading Byzantine wine laced with opium to Crimean nobles, creating a generation of debtors who bartered land for fleeting euphoria. The collateral damage was catastrophic. In Chang'an, entire quarters descended into squalor as addicted silk weavers pawned looms for drug money. A 10th century Baghdad judge's diary laments trying cases where fathers sold daughters to pay opium debts, while in Antioch, physicians wrote of nobles wasting away with perforated nasal septums, an early telltale of chronic snuff use. The road's most enduring legacy wasn't just the goods it moved, but the dependencies it manufactured, proving that addiction has always been commerce's darkest companion. The prosperity of Silk Road cities was as fragile as the glassware they traded, glittering one moment, shattered the next. These weren't just marketplaces, they were house of cards where entire economies balanced on the shifting whims of distant emperors and the fickle tides of fashion. When the caravans stopped coming, civilizations that had thrived for centuries crumbled into dust almost overnight. Take Palmyra, the desert jewel of Syria. At its peak, its colonnades dripped with gold, its merchants brokered deals between Rome and Persia, and its treasury overflowed with taxes from passing caravans. But when the Sassanids redirected trade south to bypass Pomeran tolls, the city's lifeblood drained away. Within a generation, the grand bazaars stood empty. The once proud temples became shelters for scorpions, and the oasis that had nurtured the city turned brackish from neglect. The same arches that had framed camel trains laden with spices now framed only the encroaching sands. The same tragedy unfolded in Central Asia's Merv, once the world's largest city. Nestled at the crossroads of northern and southern Silk Road routes, its workshops churned out textiles for markets from Constantinople to Canton. But when Mongol invasions and the Black Death rerouted commerce to sea lanes in the 13th century, Merv's workshops fell silent. Starving artisans stripped their own looms for firewood, and the city's 500,000 residents dwindled to a handful of squatters huddling in the ruins of madrasas. Archaeologists later found abandoned meals still sitting on tables, frozen in time when the last merchants fled. Even China's legendary Dunhuang, guardian of the Mogao caves, faced ruin when trade patterns shifted. The Tang dynasty's collapse in the 9th century severed its lifeline to the west, and the city that had hosted ambassadors from a dozen kingdoms became a ghost town. Artists who once painted Buddhist murals for wealthy patrons now scrawled desperate prayers on cave walls, last echoes of a civilization that had bet everything on the Silk Road's continuance. The cruelest irony, many of these cities accelerated their own demise. As revenues poured in, they built lavish caravanserais and widened roads, deepening their dependence on passing trade. When the Venetian merchant Niccolo da Conti visited Alexandria in the 14th century, he found dockside warehouses stacked with unsold silks, their owners still waiting for customers who would never come. The city had spent centuries perfecting its role as a gateway between East and West, but gateways swing both ways, and commerce had found new doors. These weren't natural deaths. They were the casualties of an economic monoculture where entire civilizations put all their wealth in one fragile basket, then watched helplessly as the bottom fell out. The sands that swallowed these cities weren't just desert grit. They were the accumulated consequences of betting a kingdom's future on the fickle winds of trade. The caravans that crisscrossed the Silk Road left more than just footprints in the sand. They left trails of bones. For every merchant who grew fat on trade profits, countless animals collapsed under the weight of their greed. Camels, horses, yaks, and donkeys weren't just transportation. They were disposable fuel for the Silk Road's engine, worked to death and discarded like broken tools. The road's success wasn't just built on human suffering. It ran on the corpses of creatures who had no voice in their own destruction. Bactrian camels, those iconic ships of the desert, endured the cruelest toll. Able to carry 400 pounds across waterless wastes, they were pushed beyond natural limits. Persian caravan logs from Nishapur record camels forced to march for 18 days without rest, their humps shriveled to flaps of loose skin, their hoof pads worn raw until they left bloody prints in the sand. When one faltered, merchants often slit its tendons rather than let it slow the convoy, a common practice noted in Tang Dynasty administrative manuals. Archaeologists excavating the Lop Desert recently uncovered a mass grave of camels still yoked together, their spines fused from years of untreated fractures, their teeth ground down to nubs from chewing thorny scrub when feed ran out. Horses fared no better. The famed heavenly steeds of Fergana, so prized by Chinese emperors, were routinely galloped to death on mountain passes. A Sogdian trader's contract found near Tashkent stipulates that if a horse died before reaching Dunhuang, its owner had to present the ears as proof. Otherwise, they'd be fined for losing imperial property. The Mogao Caves even preserve a grotesque mural showing horses with open sores being branded anew to hide their injuries from inspectors. But the most silent victims were the yaks of the Pamir Plateau. These shaggy beasts could navigate icy trails where camels would founder, but their thick fur hid horrific abuse. Tibetan caravan drivers drove nails into yaks' nostrils to thread control ropes, a brutality documented in 8th century cotton medical texts describing infections that slowly ate through the animals' skulls. Frozen carcasses still surface in high passes, their bones showing stress fractures from carrying loads heavier than their own weight up vertiginous slopes. Even death brought no mercy. Donkeys deemed too weak to continue were sometimes slaughtered and salted as emergency rations, a practice noted in a Byzantine soldier's memoir describing the taste as rotten leather soaked in despair. At the caravanserai of Tash Rabat, excavations revealed a cesspit filled with thousands of horse teeth, evidence of systematic starvation. Merchants extracted the teeth to sell as ivory substitutes while the emaciated bodies were left to rot. This wasn't incidental cruelty, it was calculated economics. A Yuan dynasty ledger from Karakoram coldly compares the cost of replacing a dead camel, 20 silver coins, versus resting the herd long enough to prevent death's 30 days of lost profits. The math always favored exploitation. The Silk Road didn't just kill animals, it industrialized their suffering, turning living creatures into another expendable commodity on history's most ruthless trade route. The Silk Road slave markets didn't just trade in brute labor, they dealt in human flesh sculpted into every role their buyers desired. A young boy from the steppes might be torn from his family and trained as a Mamluk warrior, his childhood erased with the edge of a sword. A girl from the Caucasus could be sold as a concubine, her beauty appraised like porcelain before being locked away in some emir's gilded harem. The road's most sought-after goods weren't spices or silks, but people forced to perform, fight, and suffer for others' amusement. Consider the fate of the so-called singing slaves of Samarkand. Persian poets wrote of Sogdian children with melodic voices, their vocal cords carefully preserved by masters who kept them half-starved to maintain their high pitches. A single off-key note could mean a lashing or worse. The 10th century chronicler Ibn Fadlan described a market where slave girls were made to dance on heated brass plates, their feet blistering to entertain potential buyers. The ones who stumbled were discarded like cracked pottery, left to beg in bazaars with scarred limbs and shattered voices, but the deadliest roles went to those drafted as slave soldiers. The Abbasid caliphs' famed Mamluks were often kidnapped as boys from Turkic tribes, their loyalties beaten into them through years of brutal training. Byzantine records tell of young recruits forced to kill their own siblings as tests of obedience, their humanity systematically erased to create perfect killers. The Ghazis of Khwarezm took this a step further. They drugged child slaves with opium before battles, sending them into frenzied charges where fear was chemically erased. Survivors were rewarded with addiction, ensuring they'd fight again for their next dose. Even royal courts weren't exempt from the horror. The Tang dynasty's pleasure districts were stocked with Persian dancing girls whose feet were broken and reset in arches to mimic the lotus gait favored by Chinese nobility. A cache of letters found near Chang'an reveals one such girl's plea to her family. "They call me white jade, but my ribs show through my skin. Last night, the prince broke my finger because my pipa playing was too slow." The cruelest irony, some slaves became commodities twice over. Eunuchs, prized as safe attendants in harems and courts, fetched astronomical prices, but the castration procedure killed 9 out of 10 boys subjected to it. Armenian medical scrolls detail how surviving victims were then sold to Venetian traders, who marketed them across Europe as living treasures. Their value came from their mutilation, their suffering commodified into prestige for wealthy elites. This wasn't just servitude, it was the systematic dismantling of human lives for entertainment, warfare, and vanity. The Silk Road didn't just transport slaves, it refined the art of breaking them, turning people into instruments tuned to their owners' whims. And when those instruments wore out, the road always had fresh replacements waiting in the next market. The Silk Road didn't just connect cities, it carved a chasm between them, leaving behind a world where a handful of trade hubs glittered with obscene wealth while the villages between them starved in their shadows. This wasn't just economic imbalance, it was a system designed to funnel riches into marble palaces while the people who grew the food, sheared the sheep, and dug the ores lived in mud huts without tasting a grain of the prosperity they made possible. The road's legacy isn't just silk and spice, it's the birth of inequality on a continental scale. Take the oasis cities of the Tarim Basin, where merchants lounged on pillows of Persian velvet, sipping wine from Byzantine glass. Just a day's ride outside their walls, farmers tilled arid soil with wooden plows, their children's bellies swollen from hunger. Tax records from cotton reveal a single merchant's import duty could exceed an entire village's annual harvest tax, and those taxes weren't spent on roads or wells for the poor. They built higher walls around the rich. A 9th century petition found near Dunhuang pleads for relief from a village headman. "Our children chew roots while the governor's horses eat millet from silver troughs. If the caravan taxes do not kill us, the next drought will." The Mongols institutionalized this divide. Their Yam postal stations became islands of luxury in a sea of deprivation, where messengers feasted on roasted lamb while local herders handed over their last goats as tributes. A Persian observer wrote of starving families near Bukhara watching imperial couriers discard half-eaten melons, fruit they'd grown but couldn't afford to taste. The cruelty was calculated. By keeping rural populations destitute, the Khans ensured a steady stream of desperate souls willing to work caravans for nothing but a handful of barley. Even religions became tools of oppression. Buddhist monasteries along the Hexi corridor amassed vast landholdings exempt from taxes, while peasant farmers tithed 40% of their meager crops. A scroll from Turfan describes monks charging pilgrims for blessed water drawn from wells the monks didn't dig, in a village they'd never visited. Meanwhile, Islamic Waqf endowments in Samarkand, meant to aid the poor, were quietly redirected to fund madrasas for merchant elite sons, locking the underclass out of education and opportunity. The most damning evidence lies in the bones. Archaeologists comparing skeletons from urban graves versus rural ones find stark differences. Trading elites show signs of lifelong abundance, healed fractures from well-treated childhood accidents, strong teeth from balanced diets. The countryfolk, stunted growth from malnutrition, spinal deformities from backbreaking labor, and telltale lesions where scurvy gnawed at their flesh. The Silk Road didn't just pass through these landscapes, it poisoned them, leaving a bitterness that lingers even today in the distrust between bustling cities and their neglected hinterlands. This inequality wasn't an accident, it was the engine that kept the whole system running. By concentrating wealth in a few hands, the road ensured there were always buyers for exotic luxuries and an endless supply of starving laborers willing to risk death carrying them. The legacy of those divides still shapes our world, where the distance between skyscrapers and slums is measured in centuries of the same brutal calculus. The fewer who have, the more the rest will scramble to survive. Beneath the Silk Road's romanticized caravans and bustling markets lies a trail of bloodstains, history hastily swept aside. These weren't just skirmishes or raids, they were wholesale butcheries, entire communities erased because they stood in the way of profit or power. The road's most brutal episodes weren't recorded in imperial chronicles. They survive only as whispers in merchant diaries or archaeological evidence of mass graves hidden beneath the sand. Take the massacre at Darya Bel, a thriving Sogdian trading post near the Sadaria River. In 722, Arab invaders under General Muslim Ibn Said slaughtered every man, woman, and child not for resistance, but as a warning to other towns considering defiance. A lone survivor's account, preserved on a scrap of leather, describes how the river ran red for 3 days as bodies clogged its bends. The killers then systematically smashed the town's irrigation canals, ensuring nothing would ever grow there again. When archaeologists excavated the site in 1998, they found ossuaries crammed with skulls bearing identical sword cuts, evidence of assembly line executions. Further east, the Aigha kingdom of Kocho met an even grislier fate. After resisting Mongol taxation in 1251, Genghis Khan's grandson Murk ordered the city razed so thoroughly that not a dog's bark would remain. Contemporary accounts describe soldiers piling corpses into pyramids and coating them with tar as monuments to obedience. But the real horror emerged in 2014, when researchers using ground-penetrating radar discovered a previously unknown mass grave beneath what's now a vineyard. The skeletal remains showed signs of being trampled by horses, a signature Mongol tactic to humiliate the dead. Some massacres were chillingly methodical. Along the Hexi corridor in 809, Tibetan raiders ambushed a Chinese New Year caravan carrying gifts for the emperor. Rather than loot the goods, they impaled 800 merchants on stakes lining the road, a grisly fence visible for miles. A Buddhist monk traveling weeks later wrote of vultures so fat from gorging they couldn't fly, while local herders refused to graze their animals near the site for fear of angry spirits. Even nature conspired in these tragedies. The lost caravan of Chuanquan, swallowed by the Taklamakan in 134 BC, wasn't just claimed by dunes. Excavations revealed the travelers had been poisoned, their water skins laced with aconite by rival merchants seeking to steal their silk. Their mummified bodies were found clutching throats, some still crouched over hastily dug graves for their companions. The Silk Road didn't just witness violence, it weaponized isolation, turning vast emptiness into an accomplice to murder. Perhaps most haunting are the anonymous killings, like the 37 skeletons unearthed near a caravanserai in Tashkent, each with hands bound behind their backs and a single dagger wound between the ribs. No records mention this event, no nearby settlements reported missing citizens. These were the road's forgotten people, slaughtered for reasons lost to time, their only epitaph the flies buzzing over their hastily covered graves. These weren't exceptions, they were the dark rhythm of the Silk Road, every oasis town built on someone else's bones, every fortune snatched from someone else's lifeless fingers. The sand that buried these atrocities didn't just hide bodies, it buried the truth that prosperity always has its losers, and history rarely remembers their names. The Silk Road didn't just transport silks and spices, it smuggled silent invaders that reshaped continents. Hidden in the folds of cargo, nestled in grain sacks, or clinging to the fur of pack animals, invasive species hitched rides across deserts and mountains, unleashing ecological chaos that outlasted empires. This wasn't accidental contamination, it was an unavoidable consequence of connecting ecosystems that had evolved apart for millennia with catastrophic results. Take the humble black rat stowing away in rice shipments from India. By the time caravans reached the Mediterranean, these rodents had colonized ports, devouring grain stores and spreading plague-infected fleas. Roman accounts from Antioch describe entire harvests lost to the dark swarm, while Nestorian monks in Persia wrote of villages abandoning their homes to creeping shadows in the granaries. The rats didn't just steal food, they disrupted entire food chains, driving native birds and reptiles to extinction as they spread. Plants proved just as destructive. Mulberry trees planted across Central Asia to feed silkworms choked out native vegetation with ruthless efficiency. In the Tarim Basin, oases that once thrived with wild apricots and tamarisks became monoculture wastelands, their rivers diverted to irrigate endless rows of mulberry orchards. A 9th century herbalist journal from Samarkand laments the disappearance of medicinal plants like wild licorice, replaced by the invader whose leaves feed worms but starve the land. But the deadliest stowaways were microscopic. Wheat rust, a fungal blight from the Caucasus, ravaged Chinese crops after hitchhiking on caravan grain. Tang dynasty edicts ordered farmers to burn entire fields to stop the spread, leading to famines that killed thousands. Meanwhile, in the opposite direction, a Central Asian aphid species decimated Mediterranean vineyards, collapsing wine economies from Greece to Gaul. The Silk Road didn't just exchange goods, it traded agricultural disasters, turning local pests into global catastrophes. The Mongols unwittingly became chief culprits. Their vast postal relay stations, where fresh horses were always waiting, became superhighways for invasive grasses. Seeds from the steppes clung to saddle blankets and hoofs, colonizing pastures as far west as Hungary. These tough, drought-resistant grasses outcompeted native flora, turning diverse meadows into monotonous grazing lands. Modern ecologists tracing soil layers can still spot the exact historical moment when Silk Road traffic introduced foreign plants, a botanical scar marking the death of pristine ecosystems. Perhaps the cruelest twist, some invasions were deliberate. Saffron crocus bulbs smuggled from Kashmir to Anatolia carried a hidden payload, nematode worms that destroyed onion and garlic crops for centuries. The Byzantine historian Procopius accused Persian merchants of biological sabotage, writing that they laughed as Roman kitchens wept over rotten bulbs. Whether by malice or negligence, the Silk Road proved that globalization's ecological toll isn't a modern phenomenon. It's as ancient as the first caravan that unknowingly carried doom in its baggage. Silk Road merchants traded in flesh as readily as fabric, but nowhere was this barter more brutal than in the trafficking of women and children. Behind the glittering markets of Samarkand and Chang'an thrived a shadow economy where young lives were appraised, branded, and sold with the same cold calculation as bolts of Damascus. Girls as young as 6 were paraded on auction blocks, their teeth inspected like livestock, their limbs measured for potential labor. A 9th-century bill of sale from Bukhara lists a 12-year-old Sogdian girl traded for 2 silver coins and a bolt of inferior silk, cheaper than the camel carrying her. The harem trade was particularly grotesque. Persian chronicles describe tribute caravans sent to Tang dynasty emperors, filled with fair-skinned Kashmiri girls whose feet were bound during the journey to deform them into the fashionable lotus gait. Byzantine envoys reported seeing Circassian children drugged with opium to endure invasive preparation exams by Arab slavers. Even high-born women weren't spared. After the Mongol sack of Baghdad in 1258, historians recorded caliphs' daughters chained together by their hair and marched to Karakoram, where they were distributed as war prizes among generals. Children faced horrors beyond imagination. In Kashgar's workshops, boys with small fingers were forced to knot carpets 12 hours a day, their growth stunted by malnutrition and spinal deformities from crouching over looms. A physician's scroll from Merv details how some developed weaver's cough from inhaling wool fibers, their lungs turning to scar tissue before they reached adulthood. Others were mutilated to increase their value. Eunuch traders in cotton perfected a technique of castrating Turkic boys with boar tusks, knowing the survivors would fetch triple price in Constantinople's slave markets. The most chilling accounts come from caravanserai cellars unearthed near Turfan, where archaeologists found tiny shackles and toy dolls carved from mutton bones. These weren't holding pens for adult laborers, they were nurseries for trafficking infants, weaned on mare's milk until old enough to be sold. A scrap of parchment lists daily rations, 1 ladle per child, less if they cry. The road's true toll wasn't measured in silver or spices, but in generations of stolen childhoods, their laughter silenced by the creak of slave wagons rolling westward into the dark. The Silk Road didn't just transport luxury goods, it reshaped the very land it crossed, diverting rivers and fields away from feeding families to line the pockets of distant elites. In the pursuit of silk, spices, and dyes, farmers were forced to abandon staple crops, turning bread baskets into monoculture wastelands where cash meant everything and hunger stalked the villages. This wasn't just an economic shift, it was a slow-moving catastrophe that left entire regions starving in the shadow of their own prosperity. Consider the lush Fergana Valley, once the granary of Central Asia. By the 8th century, local rulers had ordered every 3rd field planted with madder root, a prized dye plant for Persian carpets. Within decades, wheat yields plummeted and famine became cyclical. A Sogdian farmer's plea etched on a clay tablet reads, "The tax collector took our last sack of barley for the silk tax. My children now eat boiled leaves and the dogs have grown too weak to bark." Meanwhile, in Antioch, merchants dined on figs glazed with honey imported from these very valleys, oblivious to the desperation behind their delicacies. The Tang dynasty's obsession with tea exports devastated Sichuan's rice paddies. Peasants were ordered to uproot their crops and plant tea bushes, their compensation a pittance of the eventual sale price in Samarkand or Baghdad. When locusts descended on the remaining grain fields in 734, there was no backup harvest. Provincial records describe parents selling children for a cup of millet, while imperial warehouses overflowed with tea bricks destined for foreign aristocrats. The road's demand didn't just reshape agriculture, it turned survival into a privilege. Even the Mongols, masters of resource extraction, couldn't escape the consequences. After conquering the fertile Transoxiana region, they forced farmers to grow poppies for opium instead of wheat. The resulting famines became so severe that Marco Polo wrote of entire villages where the living gnawed the bones of the dead, while caravans laden with narcotics rolled past untouched. The cruel irony, that same opium was later traded to Chinese laborers to dull their hunger pains, creating a vicious cycle of dependency and starvation. The worst tragedies struck where irrigation systems were hijacked for cash crops. Along the Zarafshan River, melon farms for the Persian elite siphoned water from wheat fields, reducing once fertile plots to cracked earth. A Byzantine traveler's diary from 950 describes a grisly discovery near Merv. The skeletons of an entire family huddled around an empty cooking pot, their fingers still clutching the stems of wild grasses they'd gathered as last resort. The canal that might have saved them diverted months earlier to irrigate cotton for Venetian traders. This wasn't just bad luck, it was policy. Tax incentives made growing silk, tea, or indigo the only viable option for survival, even as granaries emptied. In cotton, a local governor's edict ordered the execution of farmers caught hiding grain reserves instead of planting mulberry trees. The skeletons of those who resisted were displayed along trade routes as warnings, their ribs protruding as starkly as the barren fields they'd tried to save. The Silk Road didn't just connect markets, it forged chains of hunger that bound the poor to the whims of distant appetites, proving that famine could be just another commodity traded, profited from, and forgotten. Among the Silk Road's most horrifying secrets were transactions that didn't appear in any merchant ledger, the trade in human flesh not for labor but for its very parts. While slavery was an open evil, darker practices lurked in the shadows, the harvesting and trafficking of organs and body parts, often shrouded in ritual or disguised as medicine. This wasn't just commerce crossing ethical lines, it was the commodification of life itself, where the body became a puzzle to be disassembled and sold piece by piece. Tibetan tantric rituals offer one chilling example. Manuscripts from Dunhuang describe skull cup ceremonies where the craniums of slain enemies or criminals were cleaned, gilded, and sold as sacred drinking vessels to wealthy pilgrims. These weren't symbolic objects, they were real human remains, often acquired through gruesome means. A 9th century Kashmiri traveler's account tells of a Silk Road middleman in cotton who specialized in sourcing fresh specimens, paying bandits to deliver heads intact within hours of death to preserve the bone. The trade thrived because demand outstripped supply. Tibetan monasteries paid premium prices for skulls displaying specific features, like unbroken teeth or pronounced brow ridges, believed to enhance spiritual potency. But the most systematic organ trafficking emerged from the intersection of medicine and superstition. Chinese alchemists along the route prized living cinnabar, a euphemism for human liver tissue, which they ground into powders for immortality elixirs. Tang Dynasty court records mention condemned prisoners being dissected alive in Chang'an's markets, their organs harvested before the last breath left their bodies. The practice grew so widespread that Emperor Taizong issued edicts banning the sale of prisoner remains not out of compassion, but because executioners were withholding corpses from proper burial rites, selling them instead to apothecaries. Arabian physicians took the trade even further. The Cairo Geniza documents reveal Jewish doctors in Abbasid Egypt receiving regular shipments of Persian gallbladders via Silk Road caravans used to treat epilepsy. These organs likely came from Zoroastrian prisoners of war, whose faith prohibited burial of unclean bodies, making them easy targets for grave robbers. A particularly grim contract from Samarkand details a merchant's agreement to supply 10 healthy spleens per lunar cycle to a Baghdad hospital, specifying the organs must be harvested during the waxing moon for optimal potency. Perhaps the most macabre were the so-called mummy pills of Ming Dynasty China. Wealthy patrons consumed ground-up mummified flesh, often smuggled from Egyptian tombs via the Silk Road, as a cure for internal bleeding. When genuine mummies grew scarce, enterprising merchants in Turfan began creating counterfeits using the bodies of lepers and plague victims, coating them in herbal pastes to mimic the appearance of aged preservation. A jar discovered in a Yongzhou apothecary still contained fingernail fragments and hair labeled in meticulous script, Western corpse powder for stagnation of the blood. This wasn't just fringe barbarity, it was big business. A Sogdian ledger from Panjakent lists heart, lungs, and even eyes as taxable commodities, with values adjusted for the victim's age and health. The road's true horror wasn't merely that people were bought and sold, but that they were dismantled, their very essence reduced to ingredients in someone else's ritual or remedy. In the end, the Silk Road's darkest truth wasn't just the price of goods, it was how easily life became just another item on the invoice. The Silk Road wasn't just a path for merchants, it was a weapon of empire, a blade honed by rulers who understood that controlling trade meant controlling destinies. Every caravan carried more than silks and spices. It bore the seeds of conquest, allowing empires to stretch their influence far beyond the reach of their armies. The road's winding trails became invasion routes, its bustling markets intelligence hubs, and its wealth a lure for those hungry to dominate. This wasn't commerce coexisting with conquest, it was commerce enabling it. The Tang dynasty's westward expansion shows the pattern clearly. When Chinese envoys first reached the oasis kingdoms of the Tarim Basin in the 7th century, they didn't just seek trade partners, they demanded vassals. Towns that resisted, like Khotan and Kucha, found their irrigation canals mysteriously poisoned, their caravans ambushed by bandits wearing Tang insignia under their cloaks. Surviving documents from Dunhuang reveal a chilling strategy. Merchants were ordered to report local defenses under the guise of market surveys, their ledgers later used to plan invasions. One entry notes the weakness of a Kashgar gate, where the wood is rotted by donkey urine, a detail exploited when Tang forces stormed the city in 648. But the Mongols mastered this dark symbiosis. Before launching their world-shattering campaigns, Genghis Khan's scouts traveled as wool traders, mapping pastures, counting wells, and identifying disgruntled local leaders ripe for bribes. By the time the horde arrived, they knew exactly which bridges would hold their siege engines and which officials would open gates for silver. The sack of Bukhara in 1220 wasn't just military genius, it was economic warfare. The Mongols didn't blindly raze the city, they spared craftsmen and scribes, shipping them east to serve the empire, while burning only the bazaars that had resisted their spies. The message was clear: trade on our terms or become fuel for the next conquest. Even the Romans played this game. Their craving for Chinese silk bankrolled Persian middlemen, but when prices soared, emperors didn't negotiate, they invaded. Trajan's brutal Mesopotamian campaign in 115 AD wasn't about territory. It was about seizing the silk routes from the Parthians. Legionnaires marching through Ctesiphon didn't just loot palaces, they confiscated entire merchant archives, using them to identify and tax Silk Road goods at their source. A surviving tablet from Palmyra records a Roman officer's boast: "We took their silver and their roads, so now their children will pay us for the air they breathe." The road's greatest irony: it created empires only to destroy them. The same wealth that built Samarkand's glittering towers made it a target for Timur's hordes. The caravans that enriched the Khwarezmian Shah also carried the spies who doomed him. Trade routes didn't just connect cities, they marked them for destruction, their prosperity a beacon for the next warlord hungry to carve his name in blood and gold. The Silk Road didn't just serve empires, it fed them, armed them, and ultimately buried them beneath the same sands that had once carried their glory. The Silk Road didn't end where the sand met the sea, it slinked onto waves teeming with cutthroats and renegades. While desert caravans faced bandits, maritime traders battled pirates who turned the Indian Ocean and South China Sea into hunting grounds. These weren't the romanticized rogues of legend. They were ruthless entrepreneurs who built empires on stolen cargo and broken backs, their networks stretching from Malacca to Madagascar. In the straits of Southeast Asia, the waters shimmered with danger. Chinese junks laden with porcelain and tea knew the peril of the Red Flag Fleet, a pirate armada so vast it once numbered 1,800 ships under the notorious Cheng Ai. His widow, Madame Ching, took command after his death, enforcing a code so strict that crewmen caught stealing from the shared loot had their ears nailed to the mast. By the early 19th century, her fleet controlled entire coastal villages, demanding tribute from fishermen and merchants alike. A British naval officer's journal describes finding a captured merchant ship off Hainan, its crew forced to walk the plank while pirates played dice for their belongings. But the worst horrors unfolded in the Bay of Bengal. Here, the Arakanese pirates of Burma specialized in a gruesome tactic. They'd raid Bengal's shores, slaughter entire villages, and abduct survivors to sell in Assay's slave markets. Portuguese missionary accounts tell of children chained below decks, their cries drowned out by monsoons, while pirates debated whether to sell them intact or maim them for begging rings. The scale was industrial. A single raid in 1626 netted over 4,000 captives, their fates logged in Dutch East India Company records as cargo lost to sea wolves. Even the monsoon winds conspired with these marauders. Arab dhows carrying frankincense from Oman knew to avoid the pirate coast of modern-day UAE during certain seasons, when tribal raiders rode the shifting currents to ambush sluggish vessels. A surviving captain's log from Basra recounts how his ship was chased for 3 days until the pirates closed in at dawn, their hulls smeared with luminous algae to glow like ghosts in the dark water. The crew's fate, those not killed in the attack, were sold to pearl divers in Bahrain, weighted down with stones to harvest oysters until their lungs gave out. The most brazen pirates operated with state backing. The Malabar Coast's Angria dynasty built fortress islands like Vijayadurg, where they held European trading ships for ransom under the tacit protection of local rulers. A captured British sailor's letter home describes being paraded naked through Colombo's streets, while the Angria king's accountants haggled over his price per pound of body weight. Meanwhile, in the Sulu Sea, the Aranan people turned piracy into a cultural institution, their swift prahas outrunning Spanish galleons to supply a sprawling slave trade that reached as far as Batavia. This wasn't lawless chaos, it was a shadow economy. Pirate havens like Natuna Islands functioned as twisted marketplaces where stolen silks changed hands alongside kidnapped artisans. A Javanese chronicle tells of a goldsmith forced to forge jewelry from melted-down loot, his family held hostage in a mangrove swamp until he transformed piracy's plunder into respectable wealth. The sea lanes didn't just connect honest merchants, they fed a monstrous underworld where every sunken ship meant another feast for the predators lurking just beyond the horizon. The Silk Road's dangers weren't just physical, they gnawed at the mind. Behind every successful merchant's ledger lay untold stories of shattered psyches, of men and women broken not by bandits or storms, but by the crushing weight of endless horizons and unrelenting isolation. Consider the diary of a Persian trader found near Dunhuang, its pages stained with tears and wine. 40 nights since hearing human speech. Today I argued with my shadow until it grew horns and chased me across the dunes. This wasn't poetic exaggeration, it was the unraveling of a once rational mind. Monks fared no better. The revered Buddhist pilgrim Chuanzang confessed in secret writings that he hallucinated dead companions walking beside him for weeks after they perished in a sandstorm. His official account speaks of spiritual triumph, but personal fragments tell another story, of screaming fits in the night, of begging imaginary figures to stop whispering in forgotten tongues. The Silk Road didn't just test faith, it warped perception until reality itself became untrustworthy. Cultural dislocation proved equally devastating. Arab geographer Ibn Fadlan documented a group of Viking traders who, after years among Samanid cities, could no longer bear the endless sky of their homeland. Accustomed to narrow alleyways and courtyard gardens, they became convinced the open Scandinavian horizon was swallowing them, clawing at their faces until blood ran. Several starved themselves to death rather than face the terror of unbounded space. The most tragic cases were those who made it home physically intact but psychologically ruined. A Tang Dynasty official's memoir describes his uncle returning from a 20-year Silk Road journey with pockets full of gems, and a mind convinced his family were imposters. He spent his final years building a replica caravanserai in his courtyard, greeting phantom merchants and haggling over imaginary spices until the day he died, calling for a camel that hadn't existed in decades. Even seasoned travelers cracked under the strain. Venetian merchant Pietro Dolfin's last letter before disappearing into the Pamirs reads, "The mountains have started singing my name in voices not their own. If you find this, tell my wife I went to silence them." His mummified remains were discovered 6 centuries later in a cave, surrounded by meticulous tallies of non-existent debts owed by long-dead trading partners. The road didn't just claim lives, it stole sanity, leaving behind broken minds like discarded waterskins along its endless, indifferent path. Before the Silk Road carved its path across continents, the land belonged to others, tribes and peoples whose names history erased to make room for emperors and merchants. These weren't just bystanders to the trade network's rise, they were targets of its relentless expansion, their homes trampled underfoot, their cultures smothered beneath the weight of progress. The road's glittering cities rose from graves most travelers never knew existed. Consider the Tocharians of the Tarim Basin, a Bronze Age people with flame-red hair and Europoid features who built oasis settlements millennia before Chinese silk reached the Mediterranean. Their elaborate tapestries and mummies preserved by the desert's dry air tell a story abruptly cut short. When Han Dynasty armies pushed westward in the 2nd century BC, they didn't just seek alliances, they commandeered Tocharian wells and hunting grounds, labeling the natives bandits when they resisted. A surviving wooden tablet from Lulan records a plea: "The soldiers took our last spring, our children licked dew from leaves." Within generations, the Tocharians were reduced to serving as guides for the very caravans that had stolen their future. Further west, the Saka nomads of the Pamirs faced a crueler fate. These skilled horsemen had roamed the high pastures for centuries until Persian and Macedonian merchants coveted their grazing lands for caravan rest stops. Greek historian Strabo recorded how traders deliberately introduced smallpox-infected blankets to Saka camps, clearing the way for permanent way stations. The few survivors retreated into mountain valleys, where their descendants later emerged as service tribes, grooming camels and repairing carts for merchants who'd orchestrated their near extinction. The Silk Road's most systematic erasure happened in the Fergana Valley. Here, the Dayuan people, masters of horse breeding, were massacred by Han forces in 101 BC after refusing to surrender their famed heavenly steeds. Chinese chronicles boast of poisoning every well in the region, forcing the survivors to drink from puddles fouled by rotting carcasses. Those who submitted became enslaved trainers for the imperial stables, their ancestral knowledge of equestrianism repurposed to breed warhorses for their conquerors. Even the road's infrastructure came at horrific cost. The Hexi Corridor's fortresses were built by conscripted Qiang tribespeople, their bones later found crushed beneath collapsed walls in archaeological digs. A Tang Dynasty supervisor's ledger coldly notes, 20 Qiang died digging today. Their replacements arrived tomorrow. Meanwhile, in the Caucasus, the Alans were driven from their ancestral lands to make way for Mongol postal stations. Their sacred oak groves fell to build stables. A 13th century Georgian monk's letter describes Alan children tied to trees as warning signs along newly cut roads, their decomposing bodies marking boundaries no native dared cross. The cruelest irony, many displaced groups were later romanticized as exotic attractions. The Yuezhi, once lords of the Gansu grasslands, became circus performers in Roman arenas after losing their homeland to Xiongnu raiders allied with Chinese merchants. Pliny the Elder marveled at their golden hair and azure eyes, without knowing he was gawking at a broken people whose entire world had been traded away for silk profits. These weren't incidental casualties, they were deliberate erasures. The Silk Road didn't just connect civilizations, it paved over them, turning vibrant cultures into footnotes in someone else's commercial epic. Their voices linger only in the artifacts they left behind. A child's leather shoe buried under a caravanserai's foundation, a painted ceramic shard repurposed as a merchant's dice, the faint etchings on canyon walls where entire histories were written in the language of the vanquished. The road remembered their labor but forgot their names. The Silk Road didn't just trade goods, it trafficked in destruction, transforming brilliant innovations into instruments of war. Gunpowder, originally a Chinese alchemical curiosity, became the road's most infamous export, reshaping battlefields from the steppes to the Mediterranean with a brutality no one could have imagined. What began as a formula for fireworks in Tang Dynasty laboratories ended up in Mongol siege engines, reducing cities to rubble and rewriting the rules of conquest. The journey of gunpowder westwards reads like a horror story. Arab traders first encountered it in the 8th century, not as a weapon, but as a mystical fire drug used in Taoist rituals. Yet by the time it reached Persia, alchemists had decoded its lethal potential. Manuscripts from 9th century Baghdad describe experiments where bamboo tubes packed with the powder shattered stone walls, a revelation that soon found its way into the hands of warlords. The Abbasids used primitive grenades during the siege of Byzantine forts, hurling clay pots filled with flaming powder that burned through armor and flesh alike. But the real turning point came when the Mongols, those masters of psychological warfare, got hold of the technology. Genghis Khan's successors didn't just adopt gunpowder, they industrialized it. Persian historians recount how captured Chinese engineers were forced to design siege engines for the Mongol hordes, their families held hostage to ensure compliance. At the Battle of Mohi in 1241, Hungarian knights charging across a frozen river were met with thunder crash bombs that exploded beneath the ice, drowning thousands in the frigid water. The Mongols didn't just kill their enemies, they weaponized terror itself, leaving survivors to spread tales of demons wielding fire from the sky. Yet gunpowder was just the beginning. The same caravans that carried salt and silk also transported metallurgical secrets that revolutionized slaughter. Damascus steel, forged from Indian Wootz ingots, became the prized blade of assassins and sultans alike. Its near-mythical ability to slice through armor turned skirmishes into massacres. A grisly account from the Crusades describes Richard the Lionheart's knights finding surrendered Saracen soldiers with limbs cleanly severed not by swords, but by curved sabers honed with techniques learned from Silk Road blacksmiths. Even defensive technologies morphed into tools of oppression. The Chinese invention of paper, meant for poetry and bureaucracy, became the medium for counterfeit currency that destabilized entire economies. Mongol occupiers flooded conquered territories with fake banknotes, knowing the resulting inflation would break resistance faster than any army. Meanwhile, innovations like the trebuchet and crossbow evolved through Silk Road exchanges, each iteration deadlier than the last. By the time these technologies reached Europe, they'd been refined in the crucible of Central Asian wars, where prisoners were used as live test subjects for range and penetration. The cruelest twist, many inventors never lived to see their creations perverted. The Tang alchemist who first mixed saltpeter with sulfur dreamed of immortality, not mass graves. The Persian scholar who sketched an early flamethrower meant it for clearing irrigation canals, not incinerating garrisons. The Silk Road didn't just spread knowledge, it stripped it of conscience, turning every breakthrough into a bidding war for the highest bidder with the least morality. In the end, the road's greatest legacy wasn't the treasures it carried, but the realization that no invention, no matter how noble its origins, could outrun humanity's appetite for destruction. Beneath the romantic veneer of the Silk Road's cultural exchange lies a toxic inheritance, centuries of discarded waste that still poisons landscapes from the Tarim Basin to the Mediterranean. This wasn't just casual litter, it was industrial-scale pollution where empires treated the natural world as a dumping ground for the byproducts of their greed. The sands that swallowed caravans also preserved their trash, creating an archaeological record of ecological indifference that modern scientists are only beginning to unravel. Take the mercury-laced valleys of Shaanxi, where Tang Dynasty silver mines left a legacy more enduring than any silk tapestry. To extract precious metal, miners sluiced ore with liquid mercury, a process that left entire hillsides shimmering with toxic runoff. Modern tests show soil mercury levels near ancient smelting sites at 200 times safe limits, with the poison seeping into groundwater used by villagers today. A farmer's diary from the 8th century, preserved in a Dunhuang cave, complains of crops that wilt like scorched silk and livestock born with twisted limbs, early witnesses to an environmental crime still unfolding 1,200 years later. The road's textile trade spawned its own horrors. In dyeing hubs like Bukhara, vats of indigo and madder root bled into rivers, turning waterways into stagnant, multicolored cesspools. A Persian medical text from 1050 warns against drinking from the Zarafshan River downstream of dyers' quarters, describing boils and blindness in those who ignored the advice. Archaeologists recently unearthed a 9th century dump near Samarkand filled with lead-based fabric weights, their corrosion creating a subterranean plume now threatening modern irrigation canals. But the most insidious waste was invisible. The Silk Road's insatiable demand for coins and jewelry turned mining into an ecological butcher's shop. In Afghanistan's Lapis Lazuli mines, slaves tunneled through arsenic-rich rock, their sweat carrying poison into mountain springs. Today, the bones of those workers and the unborn children of nearby villages show arsenic levels 60 times normal, a silent genocide written in skeletal DNA. Even the celebrated turquoise of Nishapur carries a dark secret. Cyanide residue from ancient extraction methods still leaches into soil, rendering orchards barren. The road's maritime branches were equally destructive. Shipwrecks off the Malabar coast reveal hulls lined with lead sheeting to deter barnacles, their slow dissolution now poisoning coral reefs. In Alexandria's harbor, archaeologists found a submerged landfill of Roman glasswork sludge, soda ash, and lime that altered marine pH for centuries, creating a dead zone where only mutant crustaceans survived. Perhaps the bitterest irony, some of this pollution became commodities themselves. The black snow of Kashgar, actually coal ash from smelters, was packaged as a medicinal powder and sold to treat skin diseases. Merchants knowingly peddled poison as cure, turning their own waste into profit twice over. The Silk Road didn't just connect civilizations, it taught them how to profit from their own destruction, leaving behind a world where the price of ancient luxuries is still paid in poisoned water and sterile soil. The Silk Road never truly vanished, it simply slipped into the shadows, its ancient paths repurposed for modern crimes. While history books depict it as a relic of the past, the same mountain passes and desert trails now funnel narcotics, weapons, and human suffering across continents with chilling efficiency. The golden age of spice caravans has given way to a black market superhighway, where the only thing traded more ruthlessly than goods is human lives. Afghanistan's opium trade follows routes eerily similar to those once trodden by medieval merchants. Poppy harvests from former Silk Road hubs like Balkh and Herat snake through the Hindu Kush on donkey trains, just as they did 1,000 years ago. Only now, the destination isn't Persian apothecaries but European streets. The UN estimates 60% of the world's heroin still travels along the Silk Road's skeletal remains, protected by warlords who have replaced Mongol Khans as the new overlords of transit taxes. In 2010, a NATO raid uncovered a Taliban ledger in Kandahar detailing payoffs to village chiefs along the exact same oasis stops Marco Polo described. The more the trade changes, the more the geography remains tragically familiar. Human trafficking mirrors the past with horrifying precision. Uighur refugees fleeing Xinjiang follow clandestine networks through Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, retracing the steps of ancient slave caravans only to end up in Middle Eastern sweatshops or Turkish brothels. Satellite imagery from 2021 revealed makeshift camps near Samarkand where traffickers hold modern trade goods before smuggling them westward. The methods have upgraded from shackles to forged passports, but the calculus of desperation remains unchanged. Even the arms trade has come full circle. The same Tajikistan valleys that once supplied Damascus steel to Mongol armies now feed AK-47s to insurgents across Asia and Africa. A 2018 Interpol sting intercepted a shipment of Ukrainian rifles hidden in a textile convoy following the exact route 14th-century swords took from Crimea to Delhi. The ledger items differ: artillery shells instead of arrowheads, methamphetamine rather than madder root dye, but the infrastructure of exploitation endures. Perhaps most disturbingly, modern cybercrime echoes the Silk Road's shadow economy. The infamous dark web marketplace adopted the name deliberately, modeling its encrypted vendor systems on the trust networks medieval traders used to navigate lawless territories. When the FBI shut down the site in 2013, they found transaction records mirroring Sogdian mercantile contracts complete with escrow payments and caravan-style routing instructions. The digital age hasn't erased these patterns, it simply digitized the same old hunger for anonymity and profit. The sands that once swallowed Camelot-era cities now conceal mass graves of refugees. The caravanserais that hosted scholarly debates have become stash houses for fentanyl precursors. The Silk Road's greatest dark truth, its legacy isn't measured in ruined monuments, but in the unbroken chain of human suffering still pulsing along its ghostly tracks, proof that some roads once built can never truly be closed. The Silk Road weaves through history draped in gold and myth, celebrated as a bridge between civilizations, but pull back that glittering curtain, and the truth is stained with blood. Beneath every romanticized tale of adventure lies the unspoken cost: slave markets where children were priced like livestock, bandits who turned mountain passes into killing fields, and plagues that raced along trade routes with the speed of wildfire. The road didn't just carry silk, it trafficked addiction, weaponized knowledge, and built empires on the backs of the forgotten. Its legacy isn't just the spices that seasoned feasts or the jade that adorned palaces. It's the bones buried beneath caravanserais, the languages erased by conquest, and the ecosystems poisoned for profit. Consider the paradox. This network, hailed as a cradle of cultural exchange, was also a graveyard for cultures. The same roads that spread Buddhism and papermaking also delivered the Black Death and Mongol siege engines. Cities like Merv and Lulan didn't just fade away, they were hollowed out by greed, their wells drained for silk-dyeing vats, their people sold off as collateral. Even the earth bears scars: mercury from Tang silver mines still seeping into water tables, deserts expanding where overgrazed pastures turned to dust. The Silk Road wasn't a path of progress, it was a churn of creation and destruction where every innovation came shackled to exploitation. So the next time you hear the Silk Road praised as history's great connector, ask yourself, connected for whom? The merchant princes who retired to Venetian mansions, or the slaves who died nameless in the Taklamakan? The monks who carried scriptures, or the children who mined lapis lazuli with arsenic burning their lungs? History loves its winners, but the road's true story is written in the silence between its celebrated milestones, in the choices we make about which voices to remember and which to leave buried in the sand. Perhaps the darkest truth of all is realizing how little has changed. The routes have shifted, the goods have digitized, but the calculus remains the same: profit for a few, paid in the suffering of many. What will future generations say about the hidden costs of our global trade?